This is a 2-minute tip video on how to create strong and thorough evidence and integrating it into your rough draft. So make sure that your evidence is something that proves your thesis statement, it's reliable, it supports your thesis. Keep in mind that your evidence is a guest speaker, so you've purposely brought it into your paper to support your thesis, and that it's thorough, and that there's enough evidence to fully prove your thesis. So if you end up needing to bring in more than one quote per body paragraph, please do that. Here are a couple things that you should avoid. Avoid citing irrelevant info. So don't cite something that's on topic but doesn't prove the thesis. So don't just pull a quote from the play to have a quote in there. You need to make sure that it supports your thesis. Avoid citing long quotes just to take up space. This is something that we see pretty often. And avoid citing evidence without a purpose. So that's probably the most important thing to take away from these 2-minute tips, is to make sure that your evidence has a purpose. So a couple things to think about when you're checking your evidence. Does it support your position? So it should support you, but not overpower you. So make sure that you're finding a balance. Is this the best piece of evidence that I can bring into my paper? So if you bring in a quote and as you're typing and you're explaining the quote, you realize that maybe it's not doing the job that you want it to do, then find yourself a different piece of evidence. And then the last thing to check is to make sure that your evidence has a purpose. So you have to make sure that it supports your paper, and you have to think about how the reader will react to it, and will the reader be able to see what your purpose is in using that piece of evidence. So now how to integrate this evidence. If you don't integrate evidence, it kind of makes things awkward and your quote is just kind of hanging there, and it is called a hanging quote. So it's there, it hasn't really been introduced, and it hasn't been explained. So it makes things a little awkward and a little bit confusing for the reader. And you may end up accidentally plagiarizing if you don't quote, but that'll be pretty hard to do with this paper because the only text that we're using is the play. So when you integrate your evidence, use ICE. We've done this since the start of the year. This will help you make sure that you get your quote in there and that you're explaining it properly. So here's an example of introduce, cite, and explain. This was taken from a prior student's paper from a couple years ago. You can see their topic sentence is at the beginning. And then we have introduce, where they introduce the quote, then they have the quote, and then they explain the quote. I have the PowerPoint for this in Schoology, so you're more than welcome to go back to read this. But you can clearly see that this is a body paragraph. It starts with the topic sentence, a little bit of info leading into the introduce, cite, and explain. And then after the explain, of course, would end up being the transition sentence to the next body paragraph. So when you integrate your evidence, make sure that your evidence supports your thesis. Make sure that you introduce the quote, cite the quote, and then you explain the quote. And this will just help you avoid plagiarism, and it'll also help the reader see where your quote begins and ends. So just a rule of thumb, make sure that your quote has a purpose, make sure that it's relevant, make sure you're not just throwing a hanging quote in there just to get your quote in there to check it off the list, but just make sure that every piece of evidence that you have in there has a purpose and that it supports your thesis statement. Avoiding plagiarism. This goes not just for evidence and not citing your evidence, but this is in general for the paper. Copying anything from a source, not using quotation marks, and passing the work off as your own. Avoid doing that. That is plagiarism.